Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. R.J. Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriella, and I'm a student in Professor R.J. Starr's Psychology of Social Media class. This week in class, Professor Starr introduced a term that really caught my attention: McVulnerability. It's a fascinating concept about how people, especially influencers, share personal struggles online in a way that feels emotionally raw but might actually be curated for engagement. I wanted to dive deeper into this topic, so I asked Professor Starr if he'd be willing to have a conversation with me about it. He agreed, and we're recording this conversation for my blog. I'll also be giving Professor Starr the audio file so he can share it on his blog as well. So, Professor Starr, thank you for taking the time to do this.
You're very welcome, Gabriella, and thank you for bringing this conversation to your blog. I think the more we critically analyze social media trends, the better we can navigate them in a way that protects our emotional well-being.
Right. And when you introduced it in class, you mentioned how the name itself, McVulnerability, suggests something mass-produced and easy to consume, kind of like fast food. Can you break that down a little more?
Absolutely. The term follows a pattern you might have heard before, adding Mick to something to suggest it's been commercialized, or like McJobs for low-wage corporate work, or McMansion for cheaply built, oversized houses. In this case, McVulnerability is about the way vulnerability is sometimes performed on social media in a way that feels formulaic rather than deeply personal. It's fast, digestible, and importantly, profitable.
That part really stood out to me. Because when I see influencers sharing their personal struggles, whether it's about mental health, relationships, or just having a bad day, I assume they're being genuine. But are you saying that some of it is more strategic than authentic?
Not always, but often enough that it's worth discussing. There's a real psychological incentive to share vulnerability online. Social media algorithms prioritize engagement, and nothing drives engagement like emotional content. When someone shares a personal struggle, especially in a way that invites sympathy, support, or admiration, it often generates more likes, comments, and shares than regular content. That, in turn, increases visibility and can even lead to financial gain through sponsorships or increased audience loyalty.
So would you say McVulnerability is always intentional? Or is it something people slip into without realizing?
That's a great question. For some influencers, it's definitely intentional. There are entire industries built around branding personal struggles in a way that keeps audiences engaged. But for others, it might be less conscious. They may start by sharing something personal out of genuine emotion, but then they notice how much attention it gets. Over time, they might feel pressure to continue sharing intimate details, even when it's not in their best interest. There's a classic concept in psychology called self-presentation theory by Erving Goffman, which essentially says that we're all performing different roles depending on our social setting. Social media amplifies this because it allows us to curate and edit what we present to the world. McVulnerability is an extension of that, where emotions themselves become part of the performance. The question then becomes, is someone expressing vulnerability in a way that's true to their lived experience, or in a way that fits what their audience expects from them?
That makes me think of people who post crying videos or share really personal confessions. Some of them seem real, but others feel, I don't know, almost too polished?
Exactly. That's one of the markers of McVulnerability, when something feels raw, but also somehow curated. Think about the classic crying video. The lighting is just right. The camera is perfectly angled. Maybe there's a soft focus filter applied. It raises the question, if someone is truly in distress, would their first instinct be to record and post it?
That makes me wonder, what does this do to audiences? Like, if I'm watching all these videos of people being vulnerable online, does it change how I think about my own emotions?
It absolutely does. And that ties directly into social comparison theory, which suggests that we evaluate ourselves based on comparisons to others. If all we see are these highly engaging, emotionally charged posts, it can distort our own perceptions of vulnerability. Someone might think, my struggles aren't as intense or beautifully expressed as this influencer's, so maybe they're not real or important. That's a dangerous cycle, because it can lead to either minimizing one's emotions or exaggerating them for the sake of validation. When vulnerability becomes content, it can distort our understanding of emotional expression. On one hand, it normalizes talking about mental health and personal struggles, which is a good thing. But on the other, it sets up an expectation that vulnerability should look a certain way, polished, well-structured, and most importantly, public. Some people may feel pressure to share their struggles online because that's what they see others doing. Or they might start believing that unless their pain is publicly acknowledged and validated by likes and comments, it's not real or important.
Wow, that's a really good point. And now I'm thinking, if people are performing vulnerability, does that also mean audiences are consuming it in a way that isn't actually helpful?
Exactly. There's a term called emotional voyeurism, where people engage with someone's emotional content not out of genuine empathy, but out of curiosity or entertainment. It's why reality TV thrives on personal drama. In the case of McVulnerability, some audiences are moved and supportive, but others are just scrolling through, consuming emotional content the same way they'd consume any other form of media. This taps into parasocial relationships, a concept first introduced by Horton and Wohl in 1956. It describes the one-sided relationships audiences develop with media figures. When someone follows an influencer who shares deeply personal struggles, it can feel like they know them, like they have a connection. But that connection isn't mutual. It's not an actual friendship, even though it feels like one. The danger here is that audiences may invest emotionally in someone who doesn't even know they exist, which can lead to misplaced trust or unhealthy attachment.
So does this mean that influencers and content creators should stop sharing personal struggles?
Not necessarily. There's real value in sharing experiences, especially when it's done with intention and authenticity. One reason McVulnerability persists is because of reinforcement theory, a concept from behaviorism. B.F. Skinner's work on operant conditioning showed that behaviors that get rewarded are more likely to continue. On social media, when someone shares a vulnerable post and gets thousands of likes, comments, and supportive messages, that acts as reinforcement. It trains people, whether consciously or unconsciously, to keep engaging in that behavior. Over time, this can create an unhealthy cycle where emotional expression becomes tied to external validation rather than genuine, self-processing. The key is awareness, both for the people posting and the people consuming. Influencers should ask themselves, am I sharing this because it helps me and others, or because I know it will get engagement? And audiences should ask, am I engaging with this content in a way that's mindful, or am I just passively consuming emotions?
That's really helpful. So what's a healthy way for people to engage with vulnerability online without falling into the McVulnerability trap?
For creators, one of the best things they can do is take a step back and ask, would I share this if social media didn't exist? If the answer is no, then maybe it's worth reconsidering. For audiences, being mindful about how emotional content affects them is important. If watching vulnerable content makes someone feel more connected and understood, that's great. But if it starts to feel performative, manipulative, or overwhelming, it might be time to step away.
I love that. I feel like I'm going to be way more aware of this now. Thank you so much for this conversation, Professor Starr. I think a lot of people will find this discussion eye-opening.
You're very welcome, Gabriella. And thank you for bringing this conversation to your blog. I think the more we critically analyze social media trends, the better we can navigate them in a way that protects our emotional well-being.
Thank you so much, Professor. That wraps up our conversation on McVulnerability. I hope you all found it as fascinating as I did. If you have thoughts on this topic, leave a comment on my blog. And stay tuned. Professor Starr will also be posting this conversation on his podcast, The Psychology of Us, with Professor R.J. Starr. Thanks for listening, everyone, and Prof, I'll see you in class.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior.
Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstar@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.